Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. Today, it's going to be a little bit different. I have with me someone that you all know very well, someone who's been a friend of this podcast and another podcast that I host, Wandering Jews, with Michal Biton, Haviv Rettig Gur. I am incredibly excited to have Haviv with me to discuss Zionism. We're going to go through the history of Zionism. We're going to then go into a personal understanding of Zionism. And then we're going to go into education and to ask, where have we failed and where do we go from here? Okay, Yalla, let's do this. Haviv, what's up?
I'm good, Noam. How are you? How are things?
I'm doing well. And I'm excited to have a deep dive conversation with you about Zionism.
Me too.
Why do you think it's important to talk about Zionism? Why does this matter?
Well, the world's attention seems to be focused on Israelis, Palestinians. There is a long-running discourse in the Arab world on Jews and on Zionism and on the history of the Jews in the 20th century that has been adopted, hook, line, and sinker almost, into Western elites and academia. And so they obsessively now talk about, there may have been 250,000 people starved to death in Yemen, which is so horrifying. Academia and journalism in the West don't think about it and don't talk about it. They only think and talk about this place. And so there's this fascination. And I think that fascination has a lot more to do with the fact that we are a way for them to tell stories about themselves. And as we fit into their stories about post-colonialism, post-imperialism, post this, post that, whether the West is good or bad, whether white people or black people are good or bad, and all of that discourse that is keeping them up nights, their deep anxieties about culture and history, we are a way to talk about it.
That's reason enough. And I'm not going to say something that different from you. I just think it's as simple as this. I think there is a lack of understanding of this term called Zionism, which either sparks a very intense emotional reaction, like, did you just out loud call yourself a Zionist? Like, you could call yourself Jewish, but calling yourself a Zionist is problematic. And then on the other hand, it's a very different perspective. I think a lot of Jewish people, when they talk about Zionism, or when Christian people talk about themselves as Zionists, I'm not sure that we're using the word in the same way. You know what I mean? I'm just not sure that when it's this strange phenomenon that the purpose of language is to be able to communicate. That's why we have a language so we can communicate. But when we have words that mean such different things to different people, oh, you're you Zionist? That's a pejorative. But I am a Zionist. I'm a proud Zionist. And then we're having a different conversation. I want to read to you this Wikipedia entry on Zionism. So Zionism, according to Wikipedia, is, and there are citations here, so it makes it true, of course. Zionism is an ethno-cultural nationalist movement that emerged in Europe in the late 19th century and aimed for the establishment of a Jewish state through the colonization of a land outside Europe. With the rejection of alternate proposals for a Jewish state, it eventually focused on the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a region.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can we already stop and take a look at that?
Go.
Yeah, you're of course raising this because Wikipedia's Zionism article has been rewritten by anti-Zionist ideologues, and Wikipedia can't find a way to write an article about Zionism that a Zionist might identify with, and it still thinks it's serving its function as Wikipedia, which it is not. This is bigotry, pure. Imagine Palestinian life, society, history article entirely written by the most right-wing Israeli Jew. That's basically what the Zionist article is. Zionists did not randomly talk about building a Jewish nation state in random places and then eventually get around to Palestine. That is simply ahistorical.
Meaning your point, Haviv, is that's not a fair retelling of what took place in the early 20th century.
So it's an ethnocultural nationalist movement that emerged in the late 19th century and aimed for the establishment of a Jewish state through the colonization of a land outside Europe. So first of all, it was not an ethnocultural nationalist movement because those words are gobbledygook. They mean whatever you need them to mean.
But they don't sound nice. They don't sound nice.
The point is that they don't sound nice. In what sense is Palestinian nationalism not ethnocultural nationalist movement? Well, but they're okay because they're allowed, right?
Yeah.
It's meaningless epithets. And B, it wasn't with the rejection of alternate proposals for a Jewish state, it eventually focused on the establishment of a Jewish, that word eventually, as though, look, really, they could have gone anywhere. I mean, in the 12th century, Rabbi Judah Halevi, his last act as one of the great poets of Spain is to get on a boat to Jerusalem, and we don't even know if he ever made it. Maimonides is buried in Tiberias, his last act. Jews talked about the land, thought about the land. There are rabbis from the early 19th century talking about moving. There's a Yemeni Jewish aliyah in the 1880s. It wasn't random, it's just completely fake, but it's a special kind of fake you can put a footnote to, and that's how academics fake academia. And it's tragic.
Basically what happened, just to go over the history, is 1903, there was a major pogrom that took place in 1903. There were many, many, many other pogroms that took place before 1903. Pogroms are state-sanctioned murders, rapes, looting of Jewish people, and it typically came in the form of Eastern European / Russian control. And what happened was in 1903, 49 Jews or so were killed in what's known as Kishinev. And someone by the name of Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was a tremendous poet, spent months thinking through what the reaction should be, and he wrote a tragic and brilliant and beautiful and controversial and provocative poem called "In the City of Slaughter," which describes what I think his language might be the pathetic nature of the Jewish people, that they can't stand up for themselves, which was such a departure from how poetry and eulogies and elegies were done throughout Jewish history until then. And then there was the Zionist Congress that took place, in which they voted for the Uganda Plan. They voted for the move to East Africa. But my understanding of that was that they voted for it as a temporary measure and in reaction to the severe anti-Semitism that took place that led to the desperation of East Africa. And then there were the Eastern Europeans who said, this is not a reasonable thing. And they sang in protest against it. Is that right?
Yeah, Joe Chamberlain, the father of Neville Chamberlain, who wanted a peace with Hitler. Joe Chamberlain was colonial secretary, and he came to the Zionists in 1903, and he said to them, hey, go for it. Take this little strip of basically a plateau in what is today Western Kenya, and what do you say? And it was brought before the Zionist Congress on account of how the British Empire was the British freaking empire. Can we say that on this podcast?
You can. Yeah,
you don't turn them down. You are still trying to negotiate with the leaders of Germany and the leaders of the slowly, imploding Ottoman Empire and the leaders of the Russian Empire and the leaders of the British Empire. And somewhere among all these leaders, you are trying to build out a case for Jewish self-reliance and Jewish safety. And so they accept this. They have a vote in the Zionist Congress. I think it's the 6th Congress in Basel. They have a vote to agree to consider the motion. And they take 2 years. Somebody goes to visit the place and they decide that it is a ridiculous idea. By the way, you know why the Zionists decided it was a ridiculous idea? Turns out there's people living there and they don't want a bunch of Europeans showing up. And that's the Uganda Plan, and it was never seriously considered. And the act of making it come up for the vote on whether to discuss it led all East European delegations from the Russian Empire to leave the room in anger. It was a reason that all kinds of others, and not only that, the Zionist movement's rejection of the Uganda Plan caused a schism in the Zionist movement. Sort of. There was a little group called territorialism instead of Zionism, right. Jewish building a state anywhere, doesn't matter where, anywhere, that abandoned the Zionist movement. And it was made up of about 4 people, all related to each other, who disbanded in 1925. So the whole idea that Zionism ever considered this, it was a motion at a meeting. And if it wasn't the British Empire asking us to colonize for it, it would never even have been raised as a serious thing. There was never, the much more successful alternative to settling in the land of Israel was Birobidzhan. the Soviet idea.
What was Birobidzhan? What was it?
Birobidzhan was the USSR in the 20s, arguing that the Jews could have a Yiddish-speaking Jewish cultural country. It wasn't its own republic within the republics of the USSR, but it was this little autonomous Jewish place. And it was sort of Stalin's answer to Zionism. Because, everyone had this problem. The Jews were fleeing en masse in their millions, and everyone was murdering them in the 30s and the 20s, long before the Holocaust. And so the Soviets said, no, you don't need Zionism. You don't need to learn Hebrew. You don't need to have a Jewish collective. You can have an old-fashioned Yiddish collective like the Pale Settlement, and can be communist and Soviet and scattered in furthest Siberia on the border, not even Siberia, on the border with China. And to this day, Yiddish is one of the official languages of this little Russian province called Birobidzhan. You can go there. There are street signs in Yiddish. And it's adorable. But
have you been?
I've never actually been. No, I've been to Moscow 3 times, but I've never actually been to Birobidzhan, which matters to me more, right? But
class field trip.
That was more successful in the sense that there are many Jews who actually went or were sent to that place. It's simply a lie that the Jews ever thought in any numbers that Zionism could ever go anywhere else. And it's a lie propagated by ideologues who have now taken over the 5th biggest website in the world.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I think people are upset about it. I want to continue going on this because you don't like their definition on their entry definition on Wikipedia. I don't think it's good either. One of the problems that I have with Zionism, though, is the definition of Zionism, the history of Zionism. Because if I were to say to you, okay, right now, Haviv, your job is to create the opening sentence of Wikipedia, because I have found that Zionism has meant and means different things to different people. I was reading this book that Yehuda Mirsky wrote about this thing called the different R's. He said, for Herzl, Zionism is rescue. For Echad Ha'am, the Zionism is renewal. And we'll talk about this. For Berdichevsky, Zionism is revolution. For Ben Yehuda, Zionism is resurrection. For Rav Kook, Zionism is redemption. You hear those 5 R's? Rescue, renewal, revolution, resurrection, redemption. What do you think about that? And do you think that there's a through line to them?
Well, first of all, I'm unimpressed. I'm deeply impressed by Mirsky and his book. He's a wonderful scholar, and it's a wonderful book. But I'm unimpressed by finding a lot of English words that begin with R-E, because it's just a function of English grammar. I'm just saying. It's like in Hebrew, because you conjugate the end of a word based on gender, rhyming is extremely easy.
Right.
But
are you taking away from like Hadag Nachash and Subliminal and their ability to...
It is easy to rhyme in Hebrew. I'm sorry. If you wanted a language that was easy... By the way, it used to be easy to rhyme in English, because English used to have gendered conjugation as well, but they lost it when the Vikings conquered England. Anyway, back to our topic. I think, first of all, Mirsky is exactly right in terms of the sort of fundamental summary of the idea of renewal, that Echad Ha'am wants to see a cultural renewal is absolutely true and beautiful, and I think Echad Ha'am would have signed off on it, and redemption is Rav Kook's overarching theme and vision. But none of it really matters, because it's all a kind of...
it's like a distraction? A red herring?
What the heck is renewal? What is the renewal of a culture?
By the way, I just came up with another R-E, red herring.
Yeah. Red herring. Which Zionist would that be? Echad Ha'am wants the renewal of a language. He wants the renewal of a culture, of a Hebrew. He thinks that things have gotten degraded in some sense, that we've lost a vigor, a cultural creative power, and he thinks that coming together in our ancient homeland, with it being inspired by that collectivism and the land itself, and having all of these factors of our identity all come together, will create a new culture. What? Look, he was talking about his own culture, and he was saying my culture is bad, and he was saying beautiful things about it, and he really wrote beautifully and respectfully, and he had this grand vision, by the way, of peace with the Arabs, which he felt deeply also people who follow in his footsteps today are deeply committed to. There's a lot to like in Echad Ha'am, except for the heart of it, which is culture is good, culture is bad, let's have a renewal of culture. I don't even know what that means. The only one of those that matters. I'll just say it like this. Noam, do you think the Messiah is coming because Israel was founded? Because if you don't, then redemption is also breathtaking, beautiful. Rav Kook wrote poetry that is astonishing. And also, there is one Zionism, and it is the only Zionism, and it is the Zionism of rescue. And all the rest is a bunch of elites writing beautiful books, trying to interpret the thing itself, but really mostly just talking about themselves. There, he said it. And now half the Jews will be angry at him.
Okay, I'm playing a game right now. Here's the game. I'm going to say a few statements, and you're going to tell me what your reaction is to them pithily. Ready? I'm saying the statement, you react. Number one, I just wrote this down as you were speaking. Zionism is justified by virtue of the Holocaust.
I don't know what justified means. Zionism is necessary, became desperately, absolutely necessary when there was no other way for Jews to survive in the Eastern Hemisphere in the 20th century.
If there was no Holocaust, does that mean that Zionism is not necessary?
Hundreds of thousands were killed and millions were fleeing before the Holocaust. And the 20th century is the bloodiest century in Jewish history without the Holocaust. So let's just, instead of Holocaust, talk about the 20th century as a whole. If there wasn't a 20th century, we'd be having a debate about Jewish rights and belonging and justification and the costs, but there was. And so there is no debate. The anti-Zionist view is that the Jews should have died. And if you don't realize that's the anti-Zionist view, then you don't know the history well enough and are ignorant. Most people are ignorant. Most people are not genocidal, but it is literally, what's the alternative? What's the third option? There was no third place to go to. Nobody would let the Jews go anywhere.
Number two, in the 19th century is when Zionism was created.
A specific rescue operation launched at Basel, but foreshadowed by some of the writings of people like Pinsker 20 years earlier, was created in the 19th century. If Zionism is the Jewish sense of belonging to the land of Israel, it's a little older than that.
Right. So that's like where I get confused. So I'm going to read you some verses. I'm going to read you some scripture over here, Haviv. Bear with me.
I can handle it. I'm the son of a rabbi.
You got this. Stay with me. Genesis 13:14-15. And God said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west, for I give all the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. Next source, in the Sifrei in Deuteronomy, which Sifrei was, it's Midrash Halacha, meaning it is from a few thousand years ago where the rabbis were like, this is Jewish law, pay close attention. Dwelling in the land of Israel is equivalent to observing all of the Torah's commandments. And then Yehuda Halevi, who you quoted earlier, was a great poet. And he spoke about, he said, my heart is in the east and I languish on the margins of the west. Throughout the Talmud, it goes through the laws of the land of Israel. Throughout the Bible, it goes through the command for Jews to settle the land of Israel. And the narrative is always where you start. So when people say Zionism started in the 19th century, I'm thrown off because on the one hand, as a movement, that's true. But then why wasn't it happening for 1800 years, for 1700 years? Like, what's the history that if it is the case that the Jewish people have had a yearning to return to their land and it's one in the same and it belongs to them and it is them. So for 1800 years, why weren't they going back? It's not like the Romans had dominion over the Jews for all these 1800 years. Why not go back in the 1500s? Why not go back in the 1200s? Why not go back in the 900s? Why did it not emerge until the late 19th century for the Jews to be like, yeah, we got to go back to our land?
Even in the late 19th century, it was a small ideological movement. When did Zionism become a majority of Jews in terms of opinion and in terms of behavior? 1920s and 30s, when the quotas came into force in the Western Hemisphere and cut off the West for the Jews, and the Jews had to flee growing persecution, and only then did they go. I would say that there are 2 points. One, a lot of Jews moved to the land of Israel over the generations, but it was always an act of deep ideological, whether religious or spiritual or some other kind of historical consciousness that would send them to the land of Israel. They were small. They would form these religious communities in Tzfat, the mystical communities of Tzfat, for example. That produced what is today essentially modern Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah is this old mystical Jewish tradition that had many, many versions, and what we basically understand today as Kabbalah was basically invented in Tzfat by this group. the students of the Vilna Gaon, and there are these religious movements that went, but two things were always lacking. One, the bigots around which Jews live, the oppression in which they live, their second-tier status under Islam and under Christianity that would fairly regularly explode into some kind of violence and oppression, was never bad enough to completely rebuild their existence. It was for short moments. It was for, the first crusade, the so-called People's Crusade, before the First Crusade, that killed a quarter or a third of the Jews of the Rhine River on its way to the Holy Land. That was bad. But it was still a limited area, and it couldn't expand, and it couldn't get all the Jews. And then in the 19th century, with trains and industrialization and urbanization and the rise of the bureaucratic modern nation state, there was a bureaucratic technology to the new nation state that for the first time could actually destroy all the Jews. It could destroy everything. It could cause catastrophes. That's a word Herzl himself used. And at a scale that required self-reliance and self-defense and collectivism to survive. And so the Zionism that turned, a group of, always marginal groups of various elite ideologues into a mass movement of the migration of millions was danger and desperation that was unique to the modern era. And that's why it never happened in the past. But if every Jew prays toward Jerusalem every time they pray, and if you can't finish the Passover Seder without saying next year in Jerusalem, and if every synagogue is built facing Jerusalem for 2,000 years, and if when the pogroms begin in the southern Russian Empire, the Jewish press in the Russian Empire, in the Pale of Settlement, calls it storms in the Negev. And so this sense of connection to the land of Israel was deep, and it was always there, and it was permanently there, and you can never find Jews who, until the modern age, for ideological reasons, who tried to excise it from Judaism. You can't excise it from Judaism. I challenge any Jew and any non-Jew to pick up a Jewish prayer book, any traditional Jewish prayer book, and even most non-traditional Jewish prayer books, and try to pray without talking about Jerusalem, and you will fail.
That's true. I think they would say that's very different than Zionism, though.
Well, it doesn't mean you have to be a modern political Zionist, right? In the sense of build a nation state now urgently. That you should be, because all the other Jews are dead.
Right. But I want
to
get back to my earlier question. I asked you, what would your Wikipedia entry of Zionism be? I want to read to you what Moshe Halbertal, who is a Jewish philosopher's definition of Zionism is. This is what he wrote. Halbertal's definition is, it's a movement that aims to deliver the Jews from the historical disgrace of dependence on other entities to determine their own fate. It's in this book, A Jewish State, 75 Perspectives.
I have no idea what disgrace means. I'm sorry. I'm a very simple person. Most
so give me your
fancy people I don't understand. But otherwise, I completely agree. Zionism, the heart of Zionism, the millions, and there are 100 ideologies that accompany it and try to explain it from within, from without, anti-pro. But the actual thing itself is a rescue project undertaken at first by a small group of Jews and then by most Jews as they came to understand that Jewish life in the 20th century could not survive because of profound changes in identity, profound changes in politics, and that the Jews who would not be rescued by Zionism stood a risk of extermination. That is Zionism.
You're Herzlian.
It's rescue.
Right. It's rescue. So if it's rescue for you, and I do think it's important to make sure that we have the different approaches of Zionism that I keep coming back to, whether it's Achad Ha'am, of renewal of Hebrew and renewal of Jewish culture, Berdichevsky. By the way, I think, one second, I am the nerdiest person you have ever met. I went to Israel recently. I didn't say hi to you, Haviv, my apologies. And I purchased Berdichevsky's Hebrew. I'm the only one I was told to ever purchase this in the bookstore there, of his essays on all topics around Israel. And he's a fascinating guy, Berdichevsky. I find him fascinating, but he was all about revolution. He was all about the removal of the Jew from Judaism, essentially. and saying Judaism was a thing of the past. I got to get away from that. I got to create something new. And that something new is in contradistinction to what was. And so what that meant is I'm shedding my, like, to use like a Kabbalistic term, my klipa, my external frame of this like weak, pale Jew who, is at the service of others, says, yes, master, and I'm going to create my own identity. Yes, master, by the way, either being God, or yes, master, or being the government or whomever they were responding to or dealing with and submissive to. And he said, no, I'm going to revolutionize this whole thing. I'm going to create the new Jew. The tan Jew, the tan Jew,
yeah.
The tan Jew.
I'm
the
agreeing
tan Jew.
Yeah, he said that.
The guy in the magazine, remember Life magazine back in the day, who was like standing with his gun and his guns, his biceps, and he's like out of the water, and he looks so good.
Oh, that's the first soldier in the Suez Canal.
Yeah, exactly. That picture, I'm like, that is what Berdichevsky had in mind. Boom, that's it.
Yeah, it's adorable. Truly, it's adorable. That guy, by the way, would become the chief armor officer of the IDF. It's what? You just confused me a lot. I have no idea what you just said. Let me just clarify for people listening. I'm not ignorant. I do know what Berdichevsky said. I was forced to read some Berdichevsky in school. It's adorable.
Cool.
It's cute. He writes about Hegel a lot for some reason. It is big and it is pompous and it is silly. I don't know what to tell you. It's like people who believe in their religious world, who find deep meaning in it, who are anchored in it as a source of culture and language, and are somehow subservient to something. But Berdichevsky is going to liberate them all. How? He's going to write some stuff in German. I look. I just don't have that much respect for intellectuals. I'm sorry. Truly. I'm a street urchin. Tell me about the people. Tell me about the people. Okay. And by the way, the anti-Zionists and the people who Wikipedia has allowed to take over in their deep bigotry, the Zionism article, you will not learn this in the Zionism article. The anti-Zionists are also these ideologues, and they talk about these complex structure. Bull.
Say it. You got it.
Totally
yes,
bull. I'm trying to be polite. Total bull.
That's good.
It's not a thing. Millions of people did not become Zionist except at great need. If you don't understand their great need, you don't understand Zionism. And if you do understand their great need, you will not give so much space to all this gobbledygook by intellectuals about other intellectuals talking about how intellectual they are. That is not what it is. It would never have succeeded if all the Zionists, had been the intellectual Zionists, of the Berdichevskys, of all the different camps, the Lilienblums and Hesses and other communists, all of the different camps, the religious ones, the Zionists and Kook and all the different camps and all their followers and all their friends and all their buddies and everyone who moved with them for fun had been in the land of Israel in 1948, they would have lost the war in about 4 hours. It is the hundreds of thousands. It is the millions. It is the people who came because there was nowhere else on earth. And if you don't know that, you don't know anything. And you don't just not know anything about now, you don't know anything about now. There's a reason Israeli left-wingers serve in the IDF at rates of 80%. The world that formed them was a world in which they could not live anywhere. They know, the Arab world pretends to be anti-Zionist. It's not anti-Zionist if you understand Zionism as a rescue project. Jews cannot live in Iraq. Jews cannot live in Yemen. Well, that makes Iraq and Yemen Zionist. I don't know what to say about that. If Jews can't live happily and for 1,000 years in safety in your land, you're a Zionist, Mazel Tov. So, there's this language, there's this discourse. Anyway, Berdichevsky, by the way, he actually made Aliyah. He actually helped Jews. He had this whole role in Hebrew. Love the guy. I respect him. The intellectual projects around these people, I don't know what to tell you. How relevant is he to you? Now, you love him because you're a nerd. By the way, I read about these people. I'm also a nerd. But is he relevant to you? Do you read him and say, aha, we have to now create a secular Jewish literature to free ourselves from the... Yeah.
I'll tell you why he is relevant to me, but we could speak about Achad Ha'am, we could speak about Chaim Nachman Bialik, we could speak about Ben Yehuda. I'll tell you why they're relevant to me. I'm going to defend the intellectual class right now. Not that I'm part of it, as far as I know. But let me in.
Where's
Let me
mine?
in.
I don't want to be a member of any club that would have me.
Exactly. So here's what I think they do well. What I think they do well is they provide language for almost anthropologically describing something that is without people necessarily realizing that they are part of that thinking. So when you see a certain type of Jewish person, I live in South Florida, and I live in a pretty, bubble in South Florida. Okay, so then you go to Tel Aviv, and you see Jews who look nothing like the Jews who you're surrounded by. And I don't want to just insult my community too much here, but their Judaism looks very different. They are aesthetically different. Their language is different. What they care about religiously is radically different. And when I see that, and some of them have such a disdain for, a galut Jew, a Jew living outside of Israel, they're just like, what are you? What are you? Are you in a museum? Do you eat bagels, cream cheese, and lox? Do you really like deli, don't you? It's kind of like the spies when they go to Israel, Canaan, that was the way they perceive themselves as being seen. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to do 5 more push-ups. I'm going to learn a little bit more Hebrew. I'm going to have a little bit more disdain for rabbis. And then I am going to be like you, kind of Zionist, right? Tel Aviv Zionist. And they don't even necessarily call themselves a Zionist, but that's why. And you see this language, this resurrection that took place, and I feel like they have something that I don't have that maybe I'm a little jealous of. But there's this resurrection of Hebrew culture, of Jewish culture, which is directly tied to being in the land and living the land and activating culture and the land and technology and all of these sorts of things. That is, I think, in the language of Berdichevsky, a revolution. That's why I find it interesting. Not that I think people are like reading Berdichevsky and then let me do the formula. I think that he is describing something that is almost prophetic at his time, but now when I look at it, I see it. And then, look, Haviv, before you jump in, on the other hand, I then go to Yehuda v'Shomron, I go to Judea, Samaria, I go to the West Bank, and I listen to them talk about their vision of Zionism and, Rav Kook and, understanding that they have a role to play in the redemption of the Jewish people, and that we're living in messianic times and we have to make sure to protect the messianic era. And that is a totally, totally different kind of Zionism also, but it's imbued with so much meaning and depth and provocation. And so, again, I'm not saying that they're reading Rav Kook and therefore they're coming up with their perspectives, but they are living a life that feels very different than my life as a self-described Zionist. And I'm wondering if we're all saying the same thing, or is it different, and what the implication is.
Look, here's how I think of it. I like Jews.
That's nice.
Not too much, but I do like them.
But I'm saying that's somewhat. So nice. That's so nice. As a Jew, that felt warm.
Yeah. Well, good. And I am a little sad. I am deeply sad that there are today maybe 6 kinds of Jews.
Okay.
Because there used to be 60. And my feeling is that the amazing strength of Israeli culture and of the resurrection of Hebrew, taking Hebrew out of the study hall, out of the synagogue, and Herzl said we can't make Hebrew the language of the new state because you can't buy a train ticket in Hebrew. Well, now you can build trains in Hebrew and you can design quantum physics experiments in Hebrew, and that's beautiful. But the reason Israelis can do that, a small group of ideologues gave them that modern Hebrew, but someone else had to take away from them 1,000-year Yiddish civilization. And someone had to take away from them a 1,500-year, 1,400-year Arabic Iraqi civilization that was built on top of the Jewish community of Iraq that had already been there 1,500 years by then. And so they are the shattered remnants that these elites that you're talking about, and whom I love passionately. I read Rav Kook to be inspired by the poetry, by the mysticism, but Rav Kook didn't save millions of Jews. What Rav Kook did do, and what Ben-Gurion did do, and what Berdichevsky, writing Jewish legends in Hebrew back in Germany in the 1910s or whatever it was, he writes Jewish legends books, right, to avoid making it religious. But he wants them to have that, the building of that culture to replace the shattering of so many Jewish cultures biomodernizing world that could not contain minorities. What happened to the Jews of Iraq happened to other minorities of Iraq. What happened to the Jews of Poland happened, Europe in World War II. We know the Holocaust, but Europe homogenized everywhere against everyone usually in ways that were much less violent because most people were deportable. The Jews were not deportable, so they had to be destroyed. Hannah Arendt said something like that, and that's how the Nazis themselves talked. And so the extermination of the Jews functionally was part of a larger European homogenization. So that destroyed these ancient civilizations, and then you had these elites that rebuilt it with these 15 different Zionist movements that all have an adjective. The cultural Zionism of Echadam and the religious Zionism of Hakuk and all of that. And so I love them. That's great. That's fantastic. You will come to Israel. You will meet 16 kinds of Zionists, and they will all have a different story. And by the way, you got a bunch of different Zionisms in Miami or wherever in South Florida you live.
Yeah.
And that's also great. And the fact that they're Haredim today is wonderful. They were saved in the Eastern Hemisphere by Zionism and nobody else. And thank God there are old, but also very new, because they've really innovated profoundly to sustain the old ways, kinds of Jewish life. So I say there was a bottleneck in the 20th century in which most of the old kinds of Jews were destroyed. And the new kinds of Jews who could survive, let's build them out to be as many new kinds of Jews as possible. Let's have as big of a diversity of Jews as possible. I basically think this about anti-Zionist Jews. I think they're adorable. They only live in safe countries. That's not an accident. That's the only place you can be anti-Zionist and not notice the lie. But I welcome it. In other words, you're a different kind of Jew. Great. Let's be that weird kind of Jew. There used to be a Bundist communist until the communists did away with them. Well, great. That was a good thing. Let's have as many kinds of Jews with different ideas, different cultures, different languages. Let's have as much variety as possible in the Jewish world. But that's ultimately a function of rescue. That's all I'm saying.
Right. And so rescue, and I want to transition to another thing that I hear often about the story of Zionism. You view Zionism as a rescue project. I want to go back to the history, and I want to quote from you different parts, different statements that were made. And I want to get your response, because the typical thing that I hear when people criticize Zionism, broadly from the left, though, again, there's critique from the right and from the religious world, but it goes something like this. So here's the argument. Zionism is colonialism. It's colonialism. And I could prove it to you from two different ways. Way number one is very simple. And this is thank you to our researcher, Alex Harris, who put this together for us. In the year 1800, in the population of Ottoman Palestine, there were 7,000 Jews, 22,000 Christians, 246,000 Muslims. Almost 90% of the population of Ottoman Palestine was Muslim. In 1890, 43,000 were Jews, 57,000 were Christians, and 432,000 were Muslims. Now it went down from 90% to 81%. 1914, 94,000 Jews, 70,000 Christians, 525,000 Muslims, down to 76%. And over the next, let's say 30 to 40 years, until the partition plan was decided in 1947 or voted upon in 1947, it was dwindling and dwindling. What's interesting about these numbers is that I'm going to give you different numbers on the population of Jerusalem that people don't typically know. In the year 1806, 2,000 Jews lived there, 2,700 Christians, and 4,000 Muslims. 23% were Jewish of Jerusalem. In 1896, that population percentage becomes 62% of Jerusalem was Jewish, 28,000. 19% were Christian, 8,700, and 19% Muslim, 8,500. And then 1922, it goes down a little bit. 54% were Jewish, 34,000. 23% were Christian, 14,700. And 21% were Muslim, 13,000, with a total of 62,578. And so it seems as though while Jerusalem is the outlier in the land of Israel, it seems as though it is the case that that over time, the fewer and fewer Muslims and more Jews were colonizing the land. I'm going to complicate this, Haviv. The complication is that the argument goes that in the Zionists' own language, they use the terms of colonialism. Jabotinsky in The Iron Wall, he really should be viewed as a disciple of Herzl, but he had a revised approach to Zionism called revisionist Zionism, which believed that the Jewish people should be settling the land, not just on the west bank of the Jordan River, but on the east bank of the Jordan River as well. And for security purposes and probably for, national homeland of Jewish people purposes. I'm reading this to you. In the Iron Wall, the Zionists want only one thing, Jewish immigration, and this Jewish immigration is what the Arabs do not want. It does not matter at all which phraseology we employ in explaining our colonizing aims, Herzl's or Sir Herbert Samuel's. Colonization carries its own explanation, the only possible explanation unalterable and as clear as daylight to every ordinary Jew and every ordinary Arab. Colonization can have only one aim, and Palestine Arabs cannot accept this aim. And then, Der Judenstaat from Herzl, your Rebbe. He says, in both countries, meaning he's talking about Palestine and Argentine, in both countries, important experiments in colonization have been made, though on the mistaken principle of a gradual infiltration of Jews. And then there were like organizations like Jewish Colonization Association, Jewish Colonial Trust, Zionist Colonization Department. Let's interpret charitably for a second. I know your blood is probably either boiling or curdling, one or the other. Something is happening here. When someone hears this, what I just described, is it possible that they could say, whoa, Zionists describe themselves as colonizers, and there were many more Muslims there than Jews. So whether or not you have a very good reason to need to leave the Eastern European, Central European, and Western European countries because they are rabidly and vociferously anti-Semitic, and let's remember Iraq as well, and other North African countries that weren't just saying, Jews, please, you have an equal seat at the table. That is not the case. But you know what? With due respect to what was going on in North Africa and Iraq and Syria and other parts, that doesn't mean that you coming to this land isn't a form of colonialism, isn't a form of imperialism. So I said a lot. What do you think?
Well, you said imperialism at the end.
Okay, fine. I'll stick with colonialism.
Well, they argue also that we're imperialism. Look, on the one hand, yeah, completely, absolutely, and in every way. There's a difference between colonizing and colonialism. Colonialism is an ism. It's a theory. It's a superstructure. It's an architecture of power. It's an ideology. It's many, many things. That it was a great many different kinds of things over a great many different periods and parts of the world. It's not just white people do it. It is a particular kind of argument that it is usually viewed by scholars as something that is accompanied by a supremacy ideology, etc. That's not the same as the word colonizing, which is just a description of people moving somewhere to settle down there. And the idea that the Zionists use the word to colonize to describe moving somewhere to settle down there is somehow a smoking gun that it is colonialism. I don't know what to say about that. Yes, Zionism colonized. What else did it do? What other word should we give it? If we call it Zionism made orange juice, that's the new term for what it did. Okay,
so how do you say it in Hebrew? It's
just a word for...
So what did they use? Lehit right.
Lehit. It was called the Yeshuv, right? The Jewish polity. Right. It wasn't yet a state. It was under the British, and before that under the Ottomans. It was called the Yeshuv. I guess that would be translated settlement, but it didn't mean a specific town or specific village. It meant the very extent, whether it was 30,000 people or 150,000 people. It was the Jewish living in, and that was colonizing. And so if you want to say colonizing, and then you want to do a quick word search on the Zionist library, which is what people like Rashid Khalidi and the anti-Zionists always do, and more power to them. Why leave, low-hanging fruit on the tree? And you want to do a word search for the word colonize, you'll do it, and you'll discover that, in fact, Zionism advocated, you're not going to believe this, it advocated Jews moving to the land of Israel in large numbers and settling there. And you will first be shocked and dismayed, and you'll fall off your chair, and then you'll begin to realize that you haven't discovered much. We have not yet accused Zionism of something. Now, then the question becomes colonialism.
Okay, fine.
And colonialism is something that just by discovering that they're colonizing doesn't mean they're colonializing. So
correct.
Then the question becomes, where is the ideological, right? And that's why the takeover of Wikipedia by these people is really important, because what they basically want to say is, first, the Jews decided to colonialize, not to colonize. It's not just that they got up and moved. They got up and moved as refugees. It's that they decided to implement, and that's why in the Wikipedia article, you'll also see that long before you get to anti-Semitism, the deep driver that created the first Zionist thinkers and the deep driver that drove millions of Jews to actually move, there's a whole section on some Zionist geneticists or some garbage silliness like that from the 19th century. And Wikipedia has succumbed to that by now deciding that Zionism is somehow some eugenic project. So our enemies have argued about us, about Zionism, that we are colonialist. In other words, colonialism is not simple colonization. Colonialism is a metropole, a country that's powerful because it's sending itself outward, that sends for usually economic gain, for imperial gain. The British took over many places to serve the empire. The French settled many places to serve the empire. It's a kind of ideological expansionism, not by the weak, but by the powerful, not by refugees with no sending country and nowhere else to go. That is not what colonialism refers to. But that is what Zionism actually is, goes the argument. And Zionism is also imperialism. Zionism, Palestinian thinkers have been arguing since the 1910s, is the arm of British imperialism or German imperialism or Russian imperialism or even Soviet imperialism. Zionism is all these bad words. And why do they say Zionism is all these bad words? Because they are all defeatable. You can defeat colonialism. The Algerians kicked the French out of Algeria. The Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. We talked about Kenya. Well, thank God we didn't take that British Kenya option, because then we would have been colonialist at the bayonet of an empire. We would have taken a place that then would have fallen in the Mau Mau rebellion, and that's what happened to the British settlement in colonialist settlement in Kenya. But I'll tell you a dark secret, Noam, that please don't share this with them, with our enemies. Please only keep this among us Zionist Jews.
Done.
And if you're an anti-Zionist Jew listening to this, you got to have our back on this one. All these theories of Zionism that didn't take into account the social reality of Zionism, the millions of desperate refugees, all those theories that are an attempt to actually avoid grappling with the social reality of what Zionism actually was, they have shattered the Palestinian cause for generations, for like 6 generations. They thought we were the arm of the British Empire, and so when they rebelled against the British Empire in the 30s, 1936 to 39, the Arab Revolt, they thought that if they could kick the British out, they would kick the Jews out. The British left and the Jews stayed. And the Jews stayed after the British to face down this revolt, crushed the Arab Revolt brutally, and armed the Jews to help them crush the Arab Revolt. All the powerful Jewish militias that are built out in the 1930s and that serve as the IDF of 1948 were built by the British as part of the attempt to crush the Arab Revolt of the 30s. In other words, the misunderstanding of who the enemy is, that view of us as imperialism, therefore if you attack imperialism, you attack us. The attack on imperialism left them unable to grapple with us. And you see this 1,000 times in the course of their history. And, I could name all those times, but just one other time, French colonialism in Algeria ended after an 8-year terror war by the FLN, the National Liberation Front, in 1962. The French just got up and left after 130 years, a real pivot of world history. And the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded by Palestinian activists in response to that. They saw what the FLN did to the great, powerful French colonialist project, and they said, we can do that to the Jews. And then began this mass campaign of organized, systematic anti-colonial terror. What has that campaign done for Palestinians? It begins in 1964, the PLO was founded, on the model of the 62 victory of the FLN, not in 67. It's not about the West Bank. It's not about Gaza. It's about the success of the Algerians against the French colonialists. If the Palestinian cause had understood that the first intifada created an Israeli left that wants peace because these children were throwing rocks at soldiers, and the second intifada destroyed that Israeli left because after all the Israeli soldiers had left all the Palestinian cities and they were negotiating shared sovereignty on the Temple Mount, 140 suicide bombings blow up in our cities. If they understand that terrorism meant to destroy us, to kick us out to some other imagined metropole that we don't have, will fail. But that a moral argument might succeed, might shift our politics profoundly. It completely reshaped Israeli politics, this first intifada demand for independence from military rule. If they stop understanding us as colonialist and imperialist and start to understand us on our terms, with our own historical experience, what it actually was, and not what they pretend and have now warped Wikipedia into claiming about us, they'll stop failing. They will stop catastrophically failing. Their liberation might actually be possible.
Haviv, I think it's really important for people to remember that the PLO was created in 1964, 3 years before there was the quadrupling of the state of Israel. I think that really matters. And also looking at Frantz Fanon would write about this, also about Algeria and throwing off the colonialists from France. Because the argument, I think, was that France doesn't have a multi-thousand-year history of praying towards this place. It's a bit different. It doesn't have thousands of years of law about how to think about Algerian land. It's obviously quite different. But I'm wondering if on the Palestinian side of things here, or let's call it those who side with the Palestinian plight against Israel. There are many Palestinians, I deeply believe, that work with Israel, that think that the future is together. I've met many of them, and I want to always platform them, because even though they are opposed to Israeli policy, they strongly really identify with the Palestinian national cause, and they should be platformed more. But I'm wondering if even do they disagree with your assessment about the relationship between Jews and the British and Western colonialists and imperialists, or do they view it as a misdiagnosis? Meaning, do they see the Zionists living in Israel as an extension of Western imperialists, and they disagree with you? Or if they were just told and explained, no, we have a totally different history from them. We have no interest in extending their hegemony. We have no interest in extending their power. It's a misdiagnosis. Which one is it?
Look, there are a lot of honest people on the other side. And when they say things like the Zionist project is, an extension, the arm of British imperialism in the Middle East, the fact is the British Empire was deeply Zionist in official policy from Balfour through San Remo in 1920, which gave the Jews the land. The Arabs were not invited to the conference. People can look that up, but not on Wikipedia.
Go to the Unpacked YouTube channel.
Yeah, exactly.
And Unpacking Israeli History.
Through the arming of the Jews in the 30s. That's all British. That's British policy. And so their great-grandparents who came up with this idea that Zionism was the outstretched arm of British imperialism, they weren't stupid. And even today, if I look back, I have to say, well, Zionism sure as heck used British imperialism every chance it got. Herzl tried to meet the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to get the land from him. He tried to use Ottoman policy and to convince the Sultan it's in the Ottoman interest. He tried to meet with the government of the Russian Empire. Zionism always used the powers that be, and therefore always looked a little bit like when Arab politicians were arguing that Israel was in 48-49, that Israel was the vanguard of world communism. Israel was being armed by Stalin through the Czechs. It was, and they're all a bunch of commies, right? Ben Gurion, the kibbutzim, right? I mean, it was never stupid. And honest people can look at us and say, I know what you are. You're what you look like, which is all these things. But always, 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 it's missing the one big fact, and it's the big fact is a sunk costs problem. You have to come to grips with just how disastrous your own policy has been. You can't miss the millions of refugees. You just can't miss them. So nobody here is an idiot. And a lot of honest people came to believe that Zionism was colonialism and imperialism and all these other things. But they just missed the millions of refugees. And they missed all the quotas and the closed doors that didn't allow the refugees to go anywhere else.
You mean Jewish refugees?
The Jewish refugees, the DPs of Europe, after the war, there's 250,000 of them. They're still in Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and Dachau 3 years after the war. When do they leave? When does anyone on earth give them a place to go? When Israel's founded. How can you miss that and still think you understand Zionism? If every single Jew in Iraq is an Israeli, that's not Zionism. Zionism is not capable of emptying New York of every single Jew. Why am I saying New York City? Because Baghdad was a quarter Jewish in the 30s. Something pushed them out. Zionism is incapable of pulling at that level. And that's what happened in the Arab world. And how do you miss that? How do you miss the emptying of 99% of Moroccan Jewry? How do you miss it? And they miss it. And so None of the arguments about us are stupid. None of them are without footnotes or without a case, but it's about what they ignore. History throws at you 500 million facts. You can only really grapple with 1,000. And you take the 1,000 that tell the story you think is the best approximation of the truth. And they choose 1,000 that is it's like a gerrymandering a district in America, where you create these weird oddball shapes trying to work around a population you don't want to vote for that congressional seat. That is how they talk about Zionism, by missing the big giant elephant in the room of history. And look, colonialism, you said it exactly right. Name another colonialist movement where every single religious institution faces the land that they're colonializing. Name another colonialist movement made up of refugees. Name another colonialist movement with nowhere to return to. The word is meant as an epithet. The word is meant as a strategic argument that we are removable by anti-colonialist means. And the Palestinians were then allowed themselves to be hoodwinked by their leadership, to be convinced that the anti-colonialist means, this terrorism that kicked out the French, that kicked out the British, that it would kick us out. And it hasn't. Those Palestinians that you're talking about, they're the redemption of us all. They do know, and they are willing to be critical, and they are willing to live with us in this land. Some of them want one state. I think most of them still want two states. I don't know who really believes two states are possible, and I happen to. I'm the idiot. Nobody listens to me. But I think that they do exist. They are serious. They are good people. They are honest people.
The Jordanian foreign minister agrees with you. He just got out there.
There
and
you
said,
go. I can't be wrong then. How could I possibly be wrong? So they do exist. And I have to tell you, I have taken my spiel talking about these mistakes that Palestinians have made in their interpretation of us over the decades and over the generation to them, to serious people there, historians and thinkers and sociologists and activists. Now, it's a self-selecting group. It's the ones who will talk to me. So it's not a whole lot of Hamas guys. But I have yet to meet someone who says to me, nope, you're totally wrong. That's crazy. They say to me, you have a real good point, and we really have to deal with this, and you're right. And then they have certain concerns, but they get it and they know it. And now the question is, what do we do with the fact that they misinterpreted us in certain ways? And that created a bad strategy. And if they had a better strategy, they could actually influence us in ways that are helpful, and not just tell us all day long, we're going to murder you, and then you're all going to leave, which is a great way to keep the Israeli left out of power for a generation. So yes, this is the fundamental question, and they do exist. We need to have this serious, honest historical conversation. And the Wikipedia thing isn't small, because it tells us that the pro-Palestinian campaign abroad doesn't want them to wake up from these mistakes. And so they are enemies of this Palestinian future that we could have.
I think it's such an important point, Haviv. It really is so important to think about how, if you're trying to eliminate the Zionist project, then that will just further entrench the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's so unwise and will lead to so many more deaths. And, I just been thinking a lot more throughout this conversation, how dangerous, just how dangerous it is for Wikipedia. We're picking on Wikipedia, but many others who just define Zionism in a way. Zionism is colonialism. Zionism is imperialism. Zionism is the negation of the other. Doing that sort of thing, I think, has this ironic entrenchment of Zionists across the world who will say, go harder, do more, entrench deeper. And it's a misdiagnosis of what the Zionist project has been for, I was going to say, either hundreds of years or thousands of years, depending on how we go through the history. But I want to ask you about this now, which is, Lord Zangwill declared, I think, that the land of Israel is a land without a people for a people without a land. Again, very poetic. But I just read you the statistics of how many Jews were there and how many Muslims were there and how many Christians were there. Like, when Palestinian intellectuals hear a comment like that from Lord Zangwill and they read the numbers of the Muslims who were there, they have the same smirk as you. They have the same, like, all right, that's quite the propagandistic line. That's quite the negation of my identity.
I urge people to look up Israel Zangwill, because not only did he said it, he did say it. He was not a mainstream centrist, Zionist figure who drove the movement. He was a marginal figure. But more importantly than that, he grew very skeptical about Zionism, because he very quickly realized that was a silly thing to say. And he himself said that is simply not true. and we all do it, all of us. I was on Twitter today. I think it was Ralph Nader. He tweeted something about how, look, here's a general in 1973 who said we attack civilians. Don't ever forget that an Israeli general in 1973 said. Israeli generals is a group of many, many thousands of people over the course of multiple generations. You know, all the Israeli generals, all the major peace moves, all the major withdrawals were carried out by also Israeli generals. Also, some of the biggest lefties in this country are the generals. Also, there are radical right-wingers who talked about forcing the Palestinians out in one massive act of ethnic cleansing. Generals, like Chavam Ze'evi. So you have, you know, the idea that you could find someone and then quote mine them and then say, aha, a general said this is Zionism. And when Ralph Nader does it, you can sort of shrug and you can say, oh, you know, just a little ideologue and liar. That's okay. But my point was also, look at what happens when I do it to Palestinians, because on October 26th, just before the Israeli ground invasion in Gaza, Ismail Haniyeh said, we need the women, children, and elderly to die to awaken our revolutionary spirit. And his whole vision is, and redeem Islam on the altar of this destruction of Gaza that Hamas engineered. Well, why can't I quote mine that? Why can't I pull that out and say, hey, look at that? That's not even quote mining. That's his fundamental vision. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, the driving force of the Great Revolt of the 30s, spent the war years in Berlin and raised battalions among Muslims in the Balkans for the Nazi war effort, and desperately hoped that the Nazis would win at El Alamein against the British, make it to Palestine, and kill every last Jew. Can we talk about the Nazism of the Palestinian national movement, or can't we? Is that quote mining, or isn't it? It's these ideological baubles, this popularity contest that we're all engaged in which we try and prove to the world that we're more or less moral, usually that the other side is so horrific you can ignore my mistakes, is usually how it goes. It's also silly and meaningless. I have met Palestinians all my life. I grew up in Jerusalem. You can't avoid Palestinians in Jerusalem, and they can't avoid Jews in Jerusalem. And I have never met a Palestinian as stupid as the depiction of Palestinians by pro-Palestinian people in the West. For example, I have often asked Palestinians during the Second Intifada when I was a soldier, and literally I was at a checkpoint where a car with 5 kilos of TNT blew up, and the car itself was destroyed. And wounded guy from my company, I kept a little bag of the shrapnel. We were supposed to gather all the shrapnel and also little bits of body parts of the bomber for the CSI, the crime scene investigators who would rebuild the bomb and build intelligence out of that bomb. And for a few years, I kept a little bag of that shrapnel, which I probably shouldn't have kept, until my wife one day threw it out and didn't tell me. That experience of being that soldier, stopping bombings into Jerusalem, sitting with my Druze platoon commander on the mountainsides of the West Bank, trying to catch suicide bombers as they sneak through the dark valleys in the night. That experience, I would take it to Palestinians and I would say to them, how do you countenance this immorality? Here we are, you, me, we're sitting. I was a guy who was, as a student, involved in all kinds of think tank projects of national narrative conversations between Jews and Palestinians. How can you justify the morality? And you know what Palestinians said to me when I said to them, how can you justify the morality of another bus bombing in Jerusalem in the morning where school kids were killed? Do you know what they said to me? They said to me, every single thing is at stake. Everything, our life, our land, our future, our kids' lives, everything's at stake. You think I give a shit about morality? That's what they say when they're being honest. And you know what? That's a moral point. That's a good moral argument. And when I heard it from Palestinians, I went to Jews and I started hearing it from Jews. Jews had always been saying it. I had always been feeling it. But when a Palestinian articulated it, I realized I think it as well. You think I, as an Israeli Jew, they're coming for my kids. Everywhere I withdraw from, Hamas will use to murder my kids. They say it. They want it. They hunger for it. They think the redemption of the world depends on it. You think you're going to tell me something about morality that I'm going to care when I think my kids are in danger? What the hell is this moral popularity contest? Neither Israelis nor Palestinians think morality matters. Why? Because there's one great overarching morality, and that is the other side wants to murder me. We have a poll out just this month. Wonderful poll by the Palestinian pollster Khalil Shikaki and an Israeli pollster Dalia Scheindlin from Tel Aviv University. And they asked Israelis and Palestinians both, do you think the other side wants to kill us all? 90% of both sides said yes. And so there is no moral popularity contest. I don't want to talk to Palestinians about their morality, and I don't want to talk about my morality because nobody gives a shit. None of the people who actually live here and for whom it matters and whose lives will be shaped by it. This is a conversation happening in the Western moral imagination of a bunch of people who think that their moral emotions are the story of the world. And they're not the story of the world. That's dehumanizing and racist and Western mental imperialism, if not actual.
Right.
I want to come to Palestinians and say, you need to learn this about me so that the war ends, because you will continue to fail if you don't. That's my only justification. That's the only thing that matters.
And what do you need to learn about them? We spent a lot of time going through the history of these tremendous moments that the Palestinians as a group, as a leadership, and probably maybe it comes from the West, have been utilized by the West in order to propagate a myth that is destructive towards Israel and Zionism, to follow in the footsteps of Algeria, to really shrink the point. Are there mistakes that the Zionists have made throughout history? When you go through the history of Israel and Zionism, are there mistakes that you're like, this is something that we could have done different, that we could have done better over the last 100 years, let's say?
Huge mistakes. Huge mistakes. I would say that, for example, the idea that settlements have to be placed around the mountains of Jerusalem to protect Jerusalem, an idea born in the experience of 49, of trying to hold that road open to Jerusalem. The idea that settlements have to push us back from the coastal plain where we're 9 miles wide, right in the middle of the country, till we hold the highlands. That I find completely reasonable. Again, I don't care about lines. I don't care about borders. I don't care about anything except my own children's safety. I find that completely reasonable. The idea that we need to place small, ideologically intense settlements of people who are capable, not all of them, not most of them, but some of them, and they're not reined in by their own leadership. And so the leadership is culpable even if it doesn't agree. Place them between major Palestinian population centers on the watershed of the West Bank, right, that big line of mountaintops that goes north-south, right down the middle of the West Bank, in which most of the Palestinian population actually lives. This is a population, this is the watershed line, is the cities of Nablus. It's the cities of Jenin, of Hebron, of Bethlehem, basically East Jerusalem. The idea that we need to place East Jerusalem is different. It's profoundly different for important reasons. It does need to be somehow shared, but it is nevertheless different from the rest. To place small settlements in places adjacent to them so that they cannot have any kind of territorial contiguity is a mistake. It's something most people don't want. It's something that drives Palestinians who don't believe in the ideologies of the major Palestinian ideological elites and factions like Hamas to the arms of those factions, because they look at the Israelis and say they're just going to take everything and take me. And so those are two, for me, morally very different things and historically very different things. We need to hold the highlands for the same reason we hold a third of the Golan Plateau right now, because otherwise they would shell us and kill us and murder us. But that doesn't mean we need to hold Shechem or Nablus, the Arabic name, or it doesn't mean we need to hold Ramallah. And so that is a big point. There have been war crimes in the history of Israel, outright war crimes. They went to the Israeli court system. The Israeli court system ruled them war crimes. We learned about them in basic training in the Israeli army.
Which ones?
The Kfar Qasim massacre I learned in my first week as an infantryman. I wasn't even an infantryman. I was my first week in basic training. I only got my rifle my second week. Before I got my rifle, they taught me about an Israeli massacre of civilian, Palestinian, Israeli citizen civilians. And we read, we learned, went through part of the Supreme Court decision that beautifully just lays out what it means, because the order was technically a legal order, and yet it's not a legal order, and the Supreme Court explains why. Right. And they want all the soldiers to know that. The idea that the Israelis made mistakes, huge mistakes.
So those are two settlements that are not strategic, war crimes such as Kfar Qasim. Have a podcast on that. I did a 30-minute articulation exploration of that moment, that tragic moment. And anything else, like policy-wise, when you look at the history of Zionism, the history of state creation, Was there something that should have been done differently? And I'm not trying to lead you. I'm wondering in 1948, prior to the Israeli-Arab War of 1948, but the civil war within Israel, is there something that could have been done differently for the Palestinian Arabs? Is there something that, when you look at the history in 67, that Israel could have done differently after quadrupling in size? Is there something different in Zionist history that could have been done differently with Oslo in the early to mid 90s? Is anything there?
I mean,
There's something that stands out. I'm really not looking to lead you in any way.
My day job is reporting on Israeli politics and analyzing Israeli politics. And when you drill down into the weeds in that way, and you get into the minutia of the day-to-day handling of a war, the day-to-day handling of a political policy or a diplomatic negotiation, then the answer is millions of mistakes at every level and at every period and in every incident. It's not, but that doesn't mean that the whole is a mistake. There are events in the 48 war that are just absolutely wrong. The founding of Israel is not wrong, and the Jews had no choice. And I refuse to be asked to relitigate it by people who want to destroy me. You're asking for me to dismantle and leave, and you're starting it by saying, in this war where we were willing to exterminate you, you pushed 700,000 of us out. I refuse to play that morality game. Does that mean that Yigal Allon, when he surrounded Tzfat and told the Arab community we're coming in the morning, and by morning they had all fled, does that mean that he behaved right or well? I don't have to accept that. I don't have to look at Israeli history and say everything's perfect. So the idea that we don't make mistakes is very silly, obviously. And nevertheless, I refuse to play this game where we're going to walk this path of Israeli mistakes down into the questioning of Israeli existence. If I did that with Palestinians, they would come out really bad. And if I did that with any nation on earth, they would come out really bad.
Great points. I'm transitioning us talking. We went through the history. We went through different moments in Zionism. We got you to laugh about Berdichevsky's poetic flourish and Rav Kook's equally poetic flourish. I love, by the way, could you imagine this? The two of them were in yeshiva together in Volozhin, which is unbelievable to think about. The two of them being together.
It tells you how elite they are.
Yeah, that's how elite they are. Right.
But also, it is unbelievable.
It's pretty cool. Yeah. But now we start talking about something else. We start talking about educationally, how to talk about Israel. And I want to frame this in a very specific way over here. Haviv, I think a lot of people think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israel-Palestine story as a team game of baseball, of basketball, football, whatever you want. And so what ends up happening is in a time of war, goes the argument, you can't possibly move an inch. One side is very clear, says the other side. One side is so good at their propaganda, is so good at their hasbara, as it's called in Hebrew, so good at dispelling myths about the other side. So the other side then has to do exactly that, but on the other side. And if Israel is at war with Palestinians and with Hezbollah in the north and with Houthis in the southeast, I guess, and with Iran in the east and the Mediterranean seas on the west, and Hamas obviously in the southwest, it's not time to do anything other than defend Israel's moves, to defend Israel's history. And the supporters of the Palestinian cause do the exact same thing. In this game of Israel versus Palestine, Israelis versus Palestinians, I'm not willing to move an inch. And I'm going to tell you why every single thing that Israel has done has been terrible, or everything the Palestinians have done has been terrible. And that is why it's so different than talking about other issues. And again, it's not exactly like Western civilization is so good at being nonpartisan and so good at seeing different sides and colors and textures of issues, whether it's, gun control or whether it's questions around gender identity and those sorts of things. It's not like we're so phenomenal at these conversations. One of the goals of this podcast is to actually get a little bit better at these conversations. that's what's going on here. It turns into a sport of sorts. So how do we talk? And I get it. If I'm a Jew in America, you've said in the past, you said this to me. You said, "Noam, you're jealous of me." This isn't the first time you told me you're jealous of me for being this Jew and this American, a Jewish American, a Jew who has all the positive things, and I could shed my identity when it comes to the terrible things of what sometimes the United States of America does. But it's also true that what happens in Israel is very much so felt by me, and it's also true that people just call me Israeli and call me and assume that every single thing that Israel does is identified with me and vice versa, even though I'm a Jew living in South Florida, living outside of Israel. And then there comes this huge problem of, well, if that's the case, then it's my job to go out there, go out to the world and defend Israel. And I'm like, I'm not the press secretary. But on the other hand, there's that defensiveness of the Jewish people who are going through a war of annihilation from the south, from the north, from the east. And then again, the Palestinians feeling very much so like they have this war of extermination against them. And so they therefore have such an inability to do anything other than fantasize and propagandize. What do we do about this?
Yeah. First of all, I share your frustration. It's so difficult, and it's so let me start by, the two sides are not equal in that particular regard. When you say we feel defensive and therefore we have to defend, the other side, what it argues about us and about our story, its attempt to rob us of our story, its attempt to define for us our story, is what it is. The fundamental point is that we should not exist, and it's a shame that we do. How do we talk about this? I think we humanize. We stop letting elites talk to us about themselves, because that's what they do. And we start going to the lived human experience. You want to understand Israelis in 48? You can't go to ideologues writing silly ideological things in 1948. You have to go to the ordinary people. The more ordinary, the better. And you have to get their life story, and then you'll understand big things. When I tell people the story of 48, I don't start 48 in the first battle between Arabs and Jews in the land. But if you want to understand the Israeli experience of that war, I started in a letter, in an entry in a memoir, actually, by a woman named Hadassah Rosenshaft, who survived Bergen-Belsen and was liberated by the British Army when it took Bergen-Belsen. And she writes in her memoir, on May 8th, that's Victory in Europe Day, she's writing a few years later, the war in Europe ended. I've often been asked how we felt on that day. Of course, we were glad to hear the news of the Allied victory, but we in Belsen did not celebrate on that day. For years, I've seen a film on television showing the world's reaction to the end of the war. In Times Square, New York, in the streets of London and Paris, people were dancing, singing, crying, embracing each other. They were filled with joy that their dear ones would soon come home. Whenever I see that film, I cry. We in Belsen did not dance on that day. We had nothing to be hopeful for. Nobody was waiting for us anywhere. We were alone and abandoned. The survivors are still stuck in Belsen 3 years later when the state of Israel is declared and they finally have somewhere to go. The 48 war is experienced. They're a quarter of the IDF in that war. It's experienced by the Israeli Jews in the brand new Israel as the first time they could defend themselves. And if you don't understand that, you will not understand why they could stick it out for 76 more years. And if you do understand it, you won't waste blood and treasure and generations trying to destroy them in ways that you just cannot possibly threaten them, because they already know what awaits them if they don't have this place. And so that's social history. And by the way, it does work in the other direction. You can't read the memoirs, the diaries of families of Palestinians from villages or from big cities. These are very different. It's a very stratified society. These are very different lived experiences, but you can't read them and not understand that there was a people and there was a displacement. And it's true that the northern Palestinian culture is very similar to Syrian, and southern Palestinian culture is very similar to Egyptian. That doesn't mean they're not a people. That doesn't mean they didn't come to define themselves and experience themselves as a people, and history made them feel like a collective, and that's how the German people came to be. It's not an argument they don't exist to argue that they formed as a national identity at one point in history. That's exactly what happened to, European nations as well. They're still a people, and they exist, and they went through deep experiences and painful experiences, and a lot of them caused by the encounter with us. But that doesn't take away from their actual suffering. And when you go back to the debates among Palestinians back in 1910, you go back to the debates in Palestinians in 1908, there's this Young Turk revolution in Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and suddenly the censorship is lifted. And you start to get this rich press that starts writing and talking and discussing. And you have a lot of Zionist agents, a lot of them Jews from the Arab world, from places like Damascus, who are fluent in the Arabic and are walking around either buying land or talking to the people or writing basically intelligence reports from the Zionist office in Jaffa, so that the movement understands what's happening on the ground as it plans, as it prepares, as it starts to build, as it fundraises. And you read their encounters and their writings about what the Arab, even just peasantry, illiterate peasants, are saying. And then you read the diaries and letters of the urban elites who are anything but illiterate. These are people who know 7 languages. And there's a people there. There is a people there. And that people had an experience and a history. And we have to see it and we have to acknowledge it. I feel, and I have to say, I'm an Israeli Jew. I feel like we have done a lot more work seeing them than they have ever done on seeing us. And never mind the moral claim, understanding us in a way that would actually give them options rather than destroy everything they ever wanted. So I think we've done a lot more work. I think their elites have proven to be a catastrophe for them and refuse to do that work and mainly just destroy. But that's my perspective as an Israeli Jew. Obviously, I'm probably missing a few things. But nevertheless, yes, it's on both sides. And if we humanize, if we go to that human experience of the lived experience of millions of people, and we shy away from elites, we shy away from asshole ideologues who scream and shout and vent, and when people start dying, all they can see is their superstructures of ideology. If we can escape the grip of these awful, evil, stupid elites, especially the intellectual ones, and just look at the lived experience of millions of people, there's no such thing as an anti-Zionist, and there's no way to avoid deep empathy with the Palestinians.
So for you, it's very much so about humanizing, I circled seeing them. And you said that as an Israeli Jew, you think that Israelis have done a bit more of that than perhaps Palestinians. I'm going to be the American now, not the Jewish. I'm shedding my Jewish part of my identity in honor of you, Haviv, and just being the American. And
I do that to a lot of Jews.
And I want to talk about where we've failed and where we go, because I actually am not sure that I see it the exact same way as you, but it's because we situate ourselves a bit differently. So I was just in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and I was in Jerusalem. And on Shabbat afternoon, I said to my wife, who was with me, who is a proud Jewish American, I said to Razi, why don't we do something different in Jerusalem? I have a buddy named Itai Flesher. I think I don't see eye to eye with him on everything, but why don't we just go on a walk with him? We went to East Jerusalem. So we went to East Jerusalem, middle of the day, Shabbat afternoon, and we went a half a block past the Jaffa Gate, and we were in a very Christian part of Jerusalem, and it was open on Shabbat, and it was lively and it was happening. A block past that, we saw different buses that were in East Jerusalem, different buses than the Egged buses. Then we went to Damascus Gate, and we hung out there for a little bit, just a block away. And then we went to Salah al-Din Street. And Salah al-Din Street was so interesting because we saw them. We saw the Palestinians living there. There's no Hebrew there. It's all in Palestinian Arab. And we went down the street. We spoke to a few Palestinians, got to know a restaurant owner, a bookshop. And then we went back towards where we were staying, a block west. And we were shipped to Poland. We were shipped to Lithuania. And there was the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Haredi Jews, and it was a block away from each other. And then another block away from there was a more western part of Jerusalem, where the Sbarro used to be, and it's just another block away, and where there was a suicide bombing right there on Jaffa Street, and then we walked back to our hotel, and it was as simple as seeing each other. I said to my wife, "What did you like?" I said, "Like," and then whatever. Then we partied Saturday night in the Shuk in Machane Yehuda. But I said, what was that like? And she used the imagery of what you just said. She just said, "I saw them. I saw them. I've spent years coming to Israel and Jerusalem, and I was always never moved past that one block." And so when I look at the history of education about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think there is a lot that we aren't seeing. I'm being literal here. There's also a line from the great medieval commentator. It's my favorite line in medieval commentary about the story of the Exodus, where Moses is described as seeing the Jewish people. And Rashi, who is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki in the 11th century, says about Moses, a lot of people saw the Jews, like they saw the slavery. But in Hebrew, he says, Natan einav libo liyot meitzar aleim, meaning, what does it mean to see? It means to give your eyes and your heart and to feel with you, to feel the empathy with you, to like be part of. There is an intransigence to see each other. And do I think it is do I think it is incredibly problematic and provocative within the Palestinian world? Oh my God, so much so. I in 2006, let's do Unpacking Israeli History this way. In 2006, I was a Hebrew U student, and I wrote a paper on the Palestinian miseducation in the PA system as Hamas was coming into power and as PA was fighting against the Hamas. And the PA was the PA, not the Hamas. But the PA, the education that was in there, was antagonistic towards the Jewish people, was indoctrinating about the lack of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, like just not there, the desire to reclaim the entire land of Israel. And that is an act of not seeing. That is an act of not seeing. So when I look back at the history of Israel and we talk about how to talk about the failures of everything, it's just about, are we willing to see each other more? And I think that will radically change everything. I really do. I think it will radically change everything for us to see each other more. And we'll see what happens from that.
Yeah, but I also think it's okay to respect each other enough to bang down that door. In other words,
what does it mean to bang down the door?
To force the other side to see you, to yell at it in its own terms, to come at it with a demand, and to come at it on its terms. In other words, to come to the other side and to say, you're screwing up for yourself, and you're screwing up for me. The refusal to see on the Palestinian side is profound and active. And what do I mean by that? Professor Muhammad Dajani, someone I think you know.
Very well.
A professor at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, taught his kids, his students, about the Jewish experience of the 20th century. For a Palestinian historian, scholar, thinker to teach his students about the Jewish experience of the 20th century is for him to teach them about their own history and about its complexity and about its causes. And he took them on a trip to Auschwitz. And he was fired from Al-Quds University for taking them on a trip to Auschwitz. He didn't turn Zionist. He didn't turn pro-Israel. He didn't turn centrist. He's very much on the Palestinian nationalist side and in the Palestinian nationalist story. But you're not going to get anywhere if you don't know the story of the Jews. And so you should know the story of the Jews. And for that, he was fired from Al-Quds University. His car was blown up, and he was forced basically into exile. Now, there are sections of Israeli society that will go violent rather than have a conversation about, but they are exceedingly small. There are very few people. I have gone on podcasts to talk about Palestinian, Israeli mistakes and Palestinian rights and what do we do about the future of the West Bank. I've gone in front of religious Zionist audiences. I have gone in front of religious Zionist audiences in settlements. And there were some people who were a little bit perturbed and some people who asked questions and interrogated very strongly. And I would tell them about these, Palestinian debates about Jews in 1910s. And my point was they're not understanding that they're refugees, but also here they are talking about them and afraid. There are people talking about this Zionist trickle. It's 1,000 people a year in the first 40 years of Zionist immigration. The Zionist trickle that's going to turn into a river and overwhelm us, and we are a nation going to its death. And you read that in a diary from 1912, and you're like, wait a second. They're human beings, three-dimensional, as clever as you, and they know exactly what's happening to them, and they have the sense of self, they have the sense of peoplehood that a nation has, and all of it. And right-wing religious Zionist Israeli audiences hear that, and can handle it. Some of them will challenge you, but they will not then say, you made it up, you lied. You could show it to them, and their world expands. There isn't that active resistance to the other side having a story that there is on the Palestinian side. And I think that the gap, if I'm being very benefit of the doubt, sort of empathetic as much as I can, and we are in a war, and I'm having a little trouble when Hamas is the number one political faction in Palestine by every poll. But nevertheless, when they look at that, there's a gap in power and a sense of vulnerability on their side, in which they believe that if they give any room to the Jewish story, then the Jewish story is empowered and can destroy them. Mm-hmm. And so they cannot give that room, that space to the Jewish story. And I think that drives some of it among ordinary people, not among intellectuals where you have all this intellectual gobbledygook, but among ordinary people. There's a resistance to the Jewish story. We don't even tell our own story to ourselves. We have ideological elites who are committed absolutely to telling Israeli young people that the story of Zionism is that there was a great awakening of national feeling, and that awakening drove people to suddenly, finally, after 2,000 years of confusion, drunken stupor, whatever it was that kept us from coming, just like you said at the beginning, what kept us from coming? Suddenly they awoke and they came and you're right. That's not what happened, but that's what we tell our kids. There's that old song, right? One morning a man stood up, felt he was a nation, and began to walk. It's the sense of like the sudden ideological awakening. That's not what happened. What happened was that millions of refugees had no other choice. They would never have arrived at that ideological redemptive experience without the desperate need. And so if we need to teach that to Israelis, so that Israelis start talking about it amongst themselves, so that Palestinians start hearing it from them, so that it enters the zeitgeist, so that it's not a new thing that some wackadoodle Israeli is trying to tell Palestinians, so that it's part of the story and the discussion.
I want to do this. This is my last and most important question. I really think it's the most important question. This podcast, Unpacking Israeli History, is all about the history of Israel, the nuance, different perspectives, making sure that we teach the heroic moments of the modern Jewish story, the salty moments, the problematic moments of modern Israeli history, trying to really figure out how to understand today. Like that's the goal of it. And not doing it in a Hasbara way. You know, the same day I got a criticism, it was awesome. I got an email saying, "Dear Noam, you have become an Arabist. You become an apologist for the Arab people, and shame on you." Next email, "Dear Noam, it's sad to see that you claim to be an educator, but really you are a wolf in sheep's clothes. And really what you are is a Hasbaraz for Israel, not an educator." So same day, a lot of fun. I didn't go to my wife crying. Don't worry. It was all good. But the real question that I have, the most important question, that's how we got to the present. But is Zionism over? Is it over? If it's the great rescue project of the Jewish people, then, well, I have two comments on that. One is, in modern liberal Western countries, whether it's Australia or the UK or Canada, not to mention the United States of America, broadly speaking, it's probably the best time ever to be a Jew living across the world. So is it the case that Zionism is over? Because this is where I will challenge your earlier point about what is the goal of Zionism. I read this in a book called A Just Zionism by Chaim Gans in a footnote. That's how good this is. It's in a footnote. He says...
That's always the best stuff.
It's the best. It's the best stuff. He says the following. Maybe I'm going to misquote this. I hope not. But basically, he argues... Oh, here it is. He argues that the role of Zionism was either to solve the problem of Jews, or is it to solve the problem of Judaism? That's what he says. Meaning, is the goal of Zionism to solve the problem of Jews, economic, social hardships, anti-Semitism, or is it to solve the problem of Judaism, meaning that Jewish identity and the continued existence of the Jews as a people, it's not going to just happen in these other countries without the land of Israel, without Israel. So what is the goal? And maybe you'll say, no, stop with your flowery intellectual elitism stuff. But what is the goal of Zionism now? If it's the rescue project, well, good job, Israel. You did it. You did it in 48. You did it in 67. You did it in 76 with Entebbe. You did it. You did it. It's over. It's over. It's over. It's done. What would you say?
Well, you said it's now safe to be a Jew in the world. Of course, you're referring to your world. It's safe to be a Jew in the English-speaking world that didn't actually impose on its Jews the 20th century that the rest of the Jews of the world experienced. And that's a great and immense and profound compliment to the English-speaking world and English-speaking civilization. Not all Jews come from there. Not all Jews went there. It is extraordinarily unsafe to be a Jew in the Arab world, in quite a few parts of the Muslim world writ large. And there was a 400% increase this year in opening files for Aliyah among French Jews. 4 times as many this year are exploring, have actually gotten in touch with the Israeli bureaucracy to talk about immigrating to Israel from France than last year. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there is a massive campaign of Islamist terrorism against French Jews that the French authorities are doing everything they can to pretend isn't happening. But there's terror attack after terror attack after terror attack, a stabbing, a rape, a murder, a shooting. It's already more than a dozen incidents that I know of. No, my Zionism is very simple. My Zionism is not some imposition of. My problem with all these intellectual versions of Zionism and with this question of is it a problem of Judaism? You're exactly right to hear me to predict that I'll have a problem with it. Zionism's job is not to build a particular cultural content. Zionism's job is not to say, this is what Jews are and there shouldn't be any other kinds of Jews. That is a stupid, elitist, silly, shallow, empty Zionism. Zionism is a rescue project. And Jews will then, having been rescued, build Jewish life and cultures all over the place in all of their diversity. That's the vision. That's the only thing that really matters. It's what actually is happening. It's what actually did happen in the past. Zionism accidentally saved Haredism. And now look at Haredism. It's gone off and flourished and built 1,000 different kinds of Haredi Judaism. Maybe that's hard for people to see from the outside who don't know it, but within, it's an incredibly diverse world. So is Zionism relevant? As long as Jews need to be protected, Zionism is relevant. The very fact that Jews are so safe now has a lot to do with Zionism. French Jews are safer in France, facing a Muslim community, some of which is incredibly integrated and incredibly liberal and modern, and a lot of which isn't. And they face an onslaught of Islamist hate, and they face just regular old European far-right anti-Semitism, and they face it with the knowledge that there's an Israel. And that's a whole different kind of facing it. And so I submit to you that without Israel, your life in America would be 10% more wary, 10% more worried about the nature of America and the promise of liberalism and whether it's being kept and whether it's collapsing and what every single political movement means. You're never going to become Israeli. You're not going to move to Israel. 99.8% of American Jews don't. But you know that there aren't the bad endings there once were for Jews because of Zionism. So no, Zionism is as relevant, real Zionism, actual Zionism, rescue Zionism, is as relevant as it ever was. Zionism will remain relevant as long as humans are human. Zionism solved the great problem of the anti-Semites' imagination, of the anti-Semites' belief that our rightful place is to serve as characters in the melodrama going on in their own heads. Now our rightful place is to live on our own cognizance and self-reliant and masters of our own fate. And until that is no longer relevant or useful, Zionism will be relevant and useful.
Haviv, that was a sweeping few hours going through the history of Zionism, going through the different flavors of adjective Zionism, to an extent lamenting the flavors of Zionism. And then going through, I think, pedagogically and educationally, what we can be doing a bit differently when we're talking about Israel, when we're talking about Zionism, when we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when we're talking about the modern Jewish story. So thank you. And I don't know, is there one book, Haviv, that you recommend? Is there, besides this podcast, Unpacking Israeli History, but is there another book that you recommend?
There's some classic histories of Zionism.
Walter Rettig Gur, is that a good one?
Yeah, Walter Rettig Gur is great. A history of Zionism, where you'll meet the characters, you'll meet the history, you'll meet the basic. There's the Zionist idea, which is just a great sort of exploration of Zionism from the intellectual side of things.
And Gil Troy did an additional volume on that.
Right, the Zionist ideas, which is the next volume, where 50 years later he really tries to tackle sort of the very big diversity of Zionist ideas, and that's really the intellectual world of Zionism.
But here's what I was going to say: I thought I was teeing you up for this, but Haviv, you failed. I thought you were going to say
it's been a long conversation.
If you want to understand the Zionism, it's not through reading books, but it's about seeing the social experience of Israel, and then you will understand Zionism.
Yes, you could also read about the social lived. There's just the lived experience of the past that created the Zionism. Wonderful book by a non-Jewish historian named Gotz Ali. Gotz is his first name, last name Aly, called Europe Against the Jews, and it is a history of the emptying of Europe of Jews before the Holocaust. And it'll break your heart, and it will make you understand. And if you then think Israel behaved wrongly and there's something wrong and we need to have a one-state future, you will be a serious person who understands the lived social history of the millions of people when you make that argument, and not an unserious person talking about your own morality. There's 1,000 books. Anita Shapira, her sort of fundamental history of Israel is also a history
I got it right here.
In the early part of Zionism.
Right here. Got it. It's a must.
Yeah.
It's a must.
Yeah. And I mean, again, there are hundreds. Yeah, do me a favor. Don't just read anti-Zionist histories of Zionism, because they will intentionally miss the elephant in favor of the mouse, in favor of a whole bunch of mice, some of which make Zionism look very bad, some of which are very bad. Not everything Zionist has always been great. We're talking about millions upon millions of people over the course of 140 years. It's not all great. People who cherry pick only the bad stuff aren't teaching you history. They're teaching you ideology. So just, read a Zionist history of Zionism among the others.
Haviv, thank you so much. Thanks for joining Unpacking Israeli History. Unpacking Israeli History is part of Unpacked, which is a division of Open Door Media. I want to thank Haviv for joining us. I want to thank our producer, Rifki Stern. I want to thank our editor, Rob Pera. And I want to thank our researcher for this episode, Alex Harris. Thank you all for joining, and see you next week.
Thank you, Noam.